Welcome back to Storytime with Pastor Cullen. We've been reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Today, we'll be reading Chapter 12, Peter's First Battle. While the dwarf and the white witch were saying this, miles away the beavers and the children were walking on hour after hour into what seemed a delicious dream. Long ago they had left their coats behind them, and by now they've even stopped saying to one another, "Look, there's a kingfisher," or "I say, bluebells," or "What is that lovely smell?" or "Just listen to that thrush." They walked on in silence, drinking it all in, passing through the patches of warm sunlight into cool green thickets, and out again into wide mossy glades where tall elms raised the leafy roof far overhead, and then into dense masses of flowering currant and among hawthorn bushes where the sweet smell was almost overpowering. They had been just as surprised as Edmund when they saw that winter was vanishing and the whole wood passing in a few hours or so from January into May. They hadn't even known for certain, as the witch did, that this was what would happen when Aslan came to Narnia. But they all knew that it was her spells which had produced the endless winter. And therefore they all knew when this magic spring began that something had gone wrong, and badly wrong, with the witch's schemes. And after the thaw had been going on for some time, they all realized that the witch would no longer be able to use her sledge. After that, they didn't hurry so much, and they allowed themselves more rest, and longer ones. They were pretty tired by now, of course, but not what I'd call bitterly tired, only slow and feeling very dreamy and quiet inside as one does when one is coming to the end of a long day in the open. Susan had a slight blister on one heel. They had left the course of the big river some time ago, for one had to turn a little to the right, that meant to be a little to the south, to reach the place of the stone table. Even if this had been their way, they couldn't have kept to the river valley once the thaw began, for with all that melting snow the river was soon in a flood, a wonderful, roaring, thundering yellow flood, and their path would have been under water. And now the sun got low, and the light got redder, and the shadows got longer, and the flowers began to think of closing. "Not long now," said Mr. Beaver, and he began leading them uphill across some very deep, springy moss. It felt nice under their tired feet, in a place where only tall trees grew, very wide apart. The climb, coming at the end of the long day, made them all pant and blow. And just as Lucy was wondering whether they could really get to the top without another long rest, suddenly they were at the top, and this is what they saw. They were on a green open space from which you could look down on a forest spreading as far as one could see in every direction, except right ahead. There, far to the east, was something twinkling and moving. "By gum," whispered Peter to Susan, "the sea!" In the very middle of this open hilltop was the stone table. It was a great, grim slab of gray stone supported on 4 upright stones. It looked very old, and it was cut all over with strange lines and figures that may be letters of an unknown language. They gave you a curious feeling when you looked at them. The next thing they saw was a pavilion pitched on one side of on an open place. A wonderful pavilion it was, and especially now when the light of the setting sun fell upon it, with sides of what looked like yellow silk and cords of crimson and tent pegs of ivory, and high above it on a pole a banner which bore a red, rampant lion fluttering in the breeze which was blowing in their faces from the far-off sea. While they were looking at this, they heard the sound of music on the right, and turning in that direction, they saw what they had come to see. Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves round him in the shape of a half-moon. There were tree women, there were well women, dryads and naiads as they used to be called in our world, who had stringed instruments. It was they who had made the music. There were 4 great centaurs, the horse part of them like a huge English farm horse. The man part was like a stern but beautiful giant. There were also unicorns, and a bull with the head of a man, and a pelican, and an eagle, and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, of whom one carried his crown, and the other carried his standard. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to do or say when they saw him. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of it now, for when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great royal, solemn, overwhelming eyes, and then they found they couldn't look at him, and they went all trembly. "Go on," whispered Mr. Beaver. "No," whispered Peter, "you first." "No, sons of Adam before animals," whispered Mr. Beaver back again. "Susan," whispered Peter, "what about you? Ladies first." "No, you're the eldest," whispered Susan. And of course, the longer they went on doing this, the more awkward they felt. Then at last Peter realized that it was laid upon him. He drew his sword and raised it to salute, and hastily saying to the others, "Come on, pull yourselves together," and he advanced to the lion and said, "We have come, Aslan." "Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he-beaver and she-beaver." His voice was deep and rich, and somehow took the fidgets out of them. They now felt glad and quiet, and it didn't seem awkward to them to stand and say nothing. "But where's the 4th?" asked Aslan. He has tried to betray them and join the White Witch, O Aslan," said Mr. Beaver, and then something made Peter say, "That was partly my fault, Aslan. I was angry with him, and I think that helped him go wrong." And Aslan said nothing either to excuse Peter or to blame him, but merely stood looking at him with his great, unchanging eyes. And it seemed to all of them that there was nothing to be said. "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "can anything be done to save Edmund?" "All shall be done," Aslan said, "but it may be harder than you think." And then he was silent again for some time. Up to that moment, Lucy had been thinking of how royal and strong and peaceful his face looked. Now it suddenly came to her ahead that he looked sad as well. But next minute that expression was quite gone. The lion shook his mane, clapped his paws together. Terrible paws, thought Lucy, if he didn't know how to velvet them, she said, and said, "Meanwhile, let the feast be prepared. Ladies, take these daughters of Eve to the pavilion and minister to them." When the girls had gone, Aslan laid his paw and though it was velveted, it was very hard, on Peter's shoulder, and said, "Come, son of Adam, and I will show you a far-off sight of the castle where you are to be king." And Peter, with his sword still drawn in his hand, went with the lion to the eastern edge of the hilltop. There a beautiful sight met their eyes. The sun was setting behind their backs. That meant the whole country below them lay in the evening light. Forest and hills and valleys, and winding away like a silver snake, the lower part of the great river. And beyond all this, miles away, was the sea. And beyond the sea, the sky, full of clouds which were turning rose color with the reflection of the sunset. But just where the land of Narnia met the sea, in fact, at the mouth of the great river, there was something on a little hill shining. It was shining because it was a castle, and of course the sunlight was reflected from all the windows which looked towards Peter and the sunset. But to Peter it looked like a great star resting on the seashore. "That, O man," said Aslan, "is Cair Paravel of the 4 thrones, in one of which you must sit as the king. I show it to you because you are the firstborn, and you shall be high king over all the rest." And once more Peter said nothing, for at that moment a strange noise woke the silence suddenly. It was like a bugle, but richer. "It is your sister's horn," said Aslan to Peter in a low voice, so low that it as to be almost a purr, if it is not disrespectful to think of a lion purring. For a moment Peter did not understand. Then, when he saw all the other creatures start forward and heard Aslan say with the wave of his paw, "Back! Let the prince win his spurs!" he did understand, and he set off running as hard as he could to the pavilion, and there he saw a dreadful sight. The naiads and dryads were scattering